A UN report found that Russian troops have committed a litany of war crimes in Ukraine: murder, torture, rape and the forced deportation of children to the Russian Federation.
One place is synonymous with the brutality of the Russian invasion. This is Bucha on the outskirts of Kyiv. The Russians occupied this small town for a month back in March 2022, massacring civilians in one of the worst atrocities of the war. Here on Yablunska Street alone, more than 60 civilians died at the hands of Russian troops.
Bucha is 30 kilometres northwest of Kyiv. This is one of the main streets today. The roads repaved, many of the homes rebuilt. This was that same street 2 years ago. The remnants of Russian tanks and personnel carriers destroyed in fighting with the Ukrainian army. What Vladimir Putin's troops left behind shocked the world. In the streets of Bucha lay the bodies, dozens of them. Just some of the estimated 400 civilians killed here by Russian paratroopers. So 2 years on, how likely is it that the victims of this atrocity and others across Ukraine will ever see justice?
Ukraine has identified so far well over 100,000 what it calls cases of war crimes. Now, what they have in mind and what they mean by a case is hard to know for sure. What we can be certain about is that they're not going to be able to investigate that number of incidents in a full and proper way that could bring it to court, to bring it to justice. For comparative purpose, in Bosnia and Herzegovina, the special chambers in the Bosnian courts had about 10,000 incidents they were looking at. They've managed to deal with a very small number, perhaps into the hundreds of those cases.
On Yablunska Street, the walls and fences still bear witness to what happened here. Just off this street, behind an office block, a makeshift memorial. This the place where 8 Ukrainian men were frog-marched by Russian soldiers and executed.
Bucha is a particular example, and Russian forces have behaved in that same kind of way in other places. From September, Russia will no longer be part of the Council of Europe and subject to the European Court of Human Rights, which is a bit of a shame because previously Russian conduct inside Russia, in Chechnya, Russian conduct in other places such as Georgia, has been subject to proceedings in the European Court of Human Rights, which have found each time that Russia's way of waging war is simply inhumane and unacceptable. And Russia accepted judgments and paid the fines and the compensation that went with it. In a sense, the Russian military sees this as a kind of byproduct of their way of conducting armed hostilities. But I think we're fairly clear that the conduct of the Russian campaign has involved an extensive use of very direct criminal violence and more indirect, indiscriminate criminal action.
On the outskirts of Bucha are the burnt-out remains of Russian armour. Here too, the town's cemetery where many of the dead now lay. There's so many of them, a special section was created, row upon row of murdered civilians. Ukraine's Prosecutor General Andriy Kostin says Vladimir Putin himself will one day be prosecuted for atrocities committed in Ukraine. Right now that looks unlikely, but Professor Gao says it's not impossible.
What we need to think about is the point at which politics in Russia changes, and it will change at some point. At that point, there will be a need to rehabilitate Russia in some sense, those who take over, even if they still remain in that same mindset and strategic culture, because let's face it, Putin is a mafioso leader on his own, but he's part of a strategic culture which has a certain perspective and a certain mentality. But I think we can anticipate that those who take over will see a need for change. And in that context, I would not exclude at all any possibility that we will see people being transferred to The Hague.
The Kremlin denies its forces killed civilians in Bucha, claiming these images were faked for the consumption of a gullible Western media. Of course, few believe that. The UN called what happened here a war crime, summary executions committed by Russian troops, atrocities for which they and those who sent them here must one day face justice. Simon Newton, Forces News, Bucha, Ukraine. Thanks for watching. For more from Forces News, like and subscribe to our channel.